She was fired for helping a veteran's dog. Minutes later, Marines stormed the Café Jacksonville, North Carolina, a small town with a big heart, especially near the military base that shaped much of its rhythm and soul. At the corner of a modest intersection stood Sunnyside Café, a humble eatery known for its hearty breakfasts and even heartier community. It was the kind of place where regulars didn't need to place their order. Emily already had it on the griddle before they even sat down. Emily Carson, 27 years old, had been waiting tables there for the past 3 years. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the warm smile in the morning, the soft voice during the afternoon lull, and the listening ear for anyone who needed it. Tall, with auburn hair usually tied up in a messy bun and freckles dotting her nose, Emily had a presence that made strangers feel like old friends. She had a way with people, but more than that, she had a way with compassion. Veterans made up a good portion of the cafe's clientele, and Emily treated them with the kind of reverence that felt deeply personal. Maybe it was the stories her grandfather used to tell about World War II, or maybe it was just who she was. Kindness made flesh. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The coffee brewed early, eggs sizzled on the grill, and the first wave of regulars had already settled into their favorite booths. Emily moved smoothly between tables, taking orders with practiced ease and tossing casual jokes back at the cook behind the counter. Outside, the heat was climbing fast. It was barely 8 o'clock and already edging toward uncomfortable. The front bell chimed. Emily turned instinctively, napkin dispenser in one hand, coffee pot in the other. An elderly man stepped inside. His walk was deliberate but heavy, aided by a cane. A large golden retriever padded silently beside him, wearing a clearly marked vest. Service animal, do not pet. Emily noticed 2 things right away. The man's eyes alert yet tired, and the dog's heavy panting. The heat had taken its toll, especially on the dog. It looked loyal, alert, and close to overheating. Emily immediately set down the coffee pot and approached them. "Good morning, sir, table for 2?" she asked with a gentle smile, nodding toward the dog. The man chuckled softly. "Yes, ma'am. He eats less than me, though." She led them to a booth near the back, closest to the air conditioner. The dog lowered himself to the floor with a quiet huff, tongue still hanging from the side of his mouth. "Would you mind if I bring him some water?" Emily offered. The man blinked. That would be mighty kind. "Thank you." Without waiting for approval from anyone else, she grabbed a clean metal bowl from the kitchen, filled it with cool water, and placed it gently in front of the retriever. She also adjusted a fan near the corner so it blew directly toward the booth. As she turned to grab a menu, she noticed the man watching her, not just with gratitude, but something else. Surprise. Maybe he hadn't expected such immediate kindness. "You're the first person who didn't treat him like a problem," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily knelt beside the dog and gave the man a soft look. "He's not a problem. He's family, isn't there?" The man nodded, pressing his hand against the dog's back. Before either of them could say more, a door swung open near the kitchen and a sharp voice cut across the room. "Emily." She looked up. Standing at the service door was Mr. Whitaker, the cafe's manager. Mid-50s, clean-shaven with a rigid posture and an even more rigid personality, he was the opposite of Emily in every way. Always concerned with appearances, rules, and efficiency. Empathy in his world was inefficient. Emily stood slowly. "Yes, sir?" His eyes flicked toward the booth. "Why is there a dog inside the cafe?" "He's a service animal," she explained. "And moved him by the AC? And he was overheating. I just brought him some water, mister." Whitaker's expression hardened. "I don't care what kind of animal it is. You know the rules, no pets in the dining area." "He's not a pet. He's a service dog. And this gentleman is a veteran." "That doesn't change policy," he snapped. "You're not authorized to make exceptions." Emily didn't move. "In public establishments. I didn't make an exception. I followed the law. Service animals are allowed." There was a beat of silence. Then Whitaker's voice dropped. "Low and Colt, we'll talk in the back now." The veteran shifted uncomfortably in his seat, already trying to stand. Emily raised a calming hand toward him. "It's okay," she said softly. She followed Whitaker into the back room, her heart thudding not from fear, but frustration. Somewhere, deep inside, she already knew. Something about this wasn't going to end quietly. The back room of the cafe was cramped, barely wide enough for a small metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a coat rack with aprons and spare uniforms. The fluorescent light above flickered faintly, casting an uneven glow over the beige walls. Emily stood with her arms folded, trying to hold onto the calm she had offered the veteran just moments ago. Mr. Whitaker shut the door behind them and crossed the space in 2 steps, his face set in stony disapproval. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but that kind of behavior is unacceptable," he said, his voice sharp and deliberate. Emily met his gaze. "What behavior? Offering a veteran and his service dog some water? Defying store policy," he snapped. "You know the guidelines, no animals near the food preparers, no exceptions without my approval. That dog should have been seated outside. There's no covered patio. It's almost 90 degrees. Outside, and the dog was overheating. Service animals are protected by law. I didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Whitaker's lips thinned. "You didn't follow my directions." "I followed the law," she replied, her tone quiet but firm. Stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "Let me make something clear. This is my cafe to run, and I won't tolerate insubordination. You don't get to make calls based on your feelings." Emily's jaw tightened. "So what would you have preferred? Let the dog collapse on the sidewalk? Ignore the fact that a veteran, someone who probably gave more to this country than either of us ever did, needed help? This isn't about patriotism," he said. "It's about following protocol. And if you can't do that, I'm not sorry," she interrupted, standing straighter now. "I'm not sorry for doing what was right." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with deliberate finality, Whitaker stepped back and pointed to the coat rack. "Turn in your apron." "You're done here." Emily didn't move. A strange stillness filled the room, as if time had briefly frozen between the words spoken and the weight of what they meant. She looked at him, not in disbelief, but with a quiet, exhausted acceptance. "You're firing me," she said, not as a question. "Yes, effective immediately." She nodded once, then walked to the coat rack, her hands steady as she untied her apron and folded it with care. She placed it gently on the desk. Without another word, she walked to the door and opened it, stepping back into the cafe floor. The sounds of the cafe seemed louder now, the soft clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. It was all the same, yet something had shifted. Heads turned as she walked through the dining area. She didn't rush. There was no panic in her steps, just a heavy sadness wrapped in dignity. The elderly veteran had stood up halfway, concern etched into every line of his weathered face. His dog, now slightly more relaxed, still watched Emily with alert eyes. "Miss, is everything all right?" he asked. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It's all right. Thank you for coming in today. You're leaving, yes? Because of me?" "Not because of you," she said softly. "Because of someone who couldn't understand." He started to protest, reaching into his pocket as if to do something, anything to fix the moment. But Emily just shook her head gently. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want this to become something uglier than it already was. Behind her, Mr. Whitaker emerged, arms crossed, standing like a wall at the kitchen entrance. Several customers had begun to notice the tension. A few whispered to one another, others simply stared. Emily turned to the rest of the cafe and for the first time allowed herself a moment to truly see the people she had served day in and day out. Mrs. Cleary by the window, always ordering oatmeal, with cinnamon. The 2 brothers who came in after morning drills. The college student who always asked for extra cream in his coffee but never sugar. Their faces, once so familiar, now looked shocked and confused. She gave them all a nod, the kind you give when words are too much and too little at the same time. Then she walked toward the door, her shoes quiet against the tiled floor. As she reached the exit, a woman near the counter stood up. "That's not right," the woman said loudly, her voice trembling with indignation. Others murmured in agreement. Someone took out their phone. Another customer, A young man in his 20s, with a baseball cap and sharp eyes, was already recording. Emily paused at the threshold. The veteran behind her called out once more. "Miss, what's your name?" She looked over her shoulder. Emily, and with that she stepped outside into the bright, punishing sunlight of the late morning. The door closed behind her with a soft chime. She stood there for a moment, blinking. Against the glare, her body aching from the weight of what had just happened. Fired. Not for being late, not for stealing or disrespecting a customer, fired for giving water to a dog, for offering comfort to a man who had once worn a uniform in defense of them all. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked to her car. It wasn't just the injustice, it was the finality of it. She had rent to pay, groceries to buy. She hadn't imagined starting her day unemployed, and yet, beneath the sorrow, there was no shame, not an ounce of it. She knew she had done the right thing. Inside the cafe, the conversation had shifted entirely. Customers whispered, argued, took photos, shared opinions. Mr. Whitaker barked orders to refocus attention, but the mood had soured, heavy with disapproval. No one knew yet that the video was already uploading. No one knew what that footage, less than a minute long, would set into motion. No one, not even Emily. The stillness inside the cafe had turned heavy after Emily's departure. For several minutes, Noon spoke. Mr. Whitaker stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway, arms rigid against his chest, eyes darting from customer to customer like he expected someone to erupt. He didn't like being challenged, least of all in front of others, especially not by a girl he had always considered too soft for this job. In his mind, this was a simple matter of discipline. Emily had crossed a line. It was that plain. Yet as the murmurs grew louder and the looks on the customers' faces turned from confused to critical, something began to fester beneath his skin. The veteran, still seated near the air conditioner, was holding his service dog's leash more tightly now, as if bracing for something. He hadn't moved since Emily left, nor had he touched the menu she'd given him. His dog, lying low but watching everything, sensed the shift in the room just as clearly as any human could. Something had broken. Mr. Whitaker finally walked over to the table. He didn't sit, didn't even offer a fake smile. His voice, when it came, was flat and cold. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The veteran looked up, startled. "Excuse me? We don't allow animals in this establishment, regardless of circumstance. That's our policy." "I'm sorry, are you not aware this is a service animal?" the man replied, his voice slow, steady but tinged with disbelief. "I don't make exceptions for anyone. This isn't personal." The veteran slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated identification card attached to his dog's vest. He placed it on the table and pushed it slightly forward. "It's federal law," he said quietly. "Being unreasonable. You're being unlawful. Service animals are allowed in public spaces. You're not just, I've told you our policy. Please take your meal outside or vacate the premises." All around them, people froze. A woman at the counter gasped audibly. One of the young men in uniform, still nursing a half-eaten plate of eggs, stood up from his booth. Others reached for their phones. The veteran rose slowly, the lines of his face deepening, not with anger but sorrow, the kind of sorrow that comes when you realize someone has chosen ignorance over compassion. "I've been shot at, seen friends fall beside me, and come home to a country that I thought would remember what we gave," he said, voice even. "And yet I get thrown out of a cafe for having the dog that keeps me sane." Mr. Whitaker didn't flinch. "I don't need a speech, just compliance." The veteran looked around the room, locking eyes with a few patrons who couldn't meet his gaze for long. He reached down, gave his dog a soft command, and the golden retriever slowly stood, ready to follow. Without another word, the man walked out the door, the bell chiming again, quieter this time, like it too was ashamed. Inside, the silence deepened. Mr. Whitaker turned and marched back to the kitchen, muttering something about order and regulations. But the damage had already spread like a quiet, creeping fire. Across the cafe, customers whispered and murmured, faces tight with discomfort. The young man who had been recording earlier was already typing on his phone, sending the footage to his social media account with a simple caption. "Fired her for helping a hero, kicked out the hero too, share this." The video showed Emily kneeling beside the dog, placing the water bowl gently on the ground, smiling at the veteran. Then Mr. Whitaker entering, pointing, arguing, and ordering her into the back. It showed the veteran's stunned expression, the patrons watching, and the silent moment when she walked out. The footage of the veteran being asked to leave came next, just over a minute of raw discomfort and authority misused. By the time Mr. Whitaker returned to his office, the cafe was no longer a quiet breakfast spot. It was a stage, and the audience was growing restless. Outside, Emily sat in her car with the windows down, trying to collect herself. She hadn't driven off yet. A part of her hoped maybe someone would come after her, not to offer her job back. She wouldn't take it, but to tell her she wasn't wrong, to make her feel like she hadn't just been erased for showing decency. She heard the cafe door open again and glanced toward it instinctively. The veteran emerged with his dog and stood in the sun for a moment, then spotted her. Without hesitation, he walked toward her car. She got out to meet him halfway. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "You don't owe me an apology," she replied. You shouldn't have been treated like that." "No one," the veteran nodded once. "He helps me breathe, that dog, helps me get through nights. People think it's just about guiding or fetching, but it's more than that. He keeps the nightmares from getting too loud." Emily reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear, then looked up again. "I'm glad you have him, and I'm glad I could help at least a little." He reached into his coat and handed her a card. "If you ever need anything at all, call this number. Name's Granger. Sergeant Thomas Granger, retired." Emily took the card, glanced at the simple print, then back at the man. "Thank you." Granger gave a small nod, then walked back toward his truck, dog trotting loyally beside him. Ash climbed in. Emily still hadn't moved. Her fingers closed around the card like it was something more than cardboard, like it was a thread connecting her to something not yet visible. No one could yet predict the wave that had already begun to rise. No one knew that across town, phones were lighting up, that Granger's name would soon echo far beyond that small cafe. But in that moment, something irrevocable had been set in motion, and no policy, no regulation, no cold dismissal could undo. The next morning, the sun broke over Jacksonville with the same quiet determination it did every day, spreading light across neighborhoods still lost in sleep. But for Emily, there was no familiar rhythm, no alarm clock to rush her toward her morning shift, no uniform to iron, no early brew of coffee waiting at the cafe. She woke slowly, the weight of the previous day still wrapped around her like a damp blanket. The silence of her apartment was unfamiliar and unwelcome. She moved through her morning like a ghost, showering, dressing, tying her hair into the same bun she always wore to work, before realizing halfway through that she had nowhere to go. Her phone buzzed a few times, messages from co-workers who had seen what happened but didn't know what to say, and others from customers offering vague support. Nothing concrete. Nothing that changed the reality of her sudden unemployment. By mid-morning, she was sitting on the small balcony outside her apartment, sipping tea that had gone cold. The world moved on without her, cars humming down the street, children laughing. Somewhere in the distance, her mind kept replaying the moment she handed in her apron, the sound of the bell as she exited, the veteran's face filled with disbelief. But what she didn't know was that something had shifted far beyond the quiet streets of her neighborhood. While she sat wrapped in the stillness of her grief, the video continued to move, crossing phones, timelines, and groups like a spark in dry grass. It was shared not only by strangers outraged by the injustice, but also by those who recognized the man in the footage. Sergeant Thomas Granger was not just any veteran. Among the military community in Jacksonville and beyond, his name carried weight. He had served with distinction, endured loss, and returned home with the respect of countless Marines. When fellow servicemen saw the footage of him being escorted out of a cafe, not for a protest or confrontation, but for simply existing with the dog that helped him survive, the reaction was swift. Veterans started calling each other. Former Marines began resharing the clip. Active duty service members, many of whom had once sat in the booths of that very cafe, posted the video with captions of solidarity. The voice of one man's humiliation became the voice of many, But Emily knew none of this. She only knew the ache of losing a job for doing what she thought was right. Later that afternoon, she drove past the cafe, not out of regret, but curiosity. She parked across the street, hidden behind a large truck, and watched from a distance. The sign out front still read Sunnyside Cafe, its yellow paint starting to fade. Through the windows she saw the usual tables and chairs, the counter, the same booths she had cleaned every day. But the atmosphere was different. The customers were fewer. The energy was strained. Even from across the street she could sense it. She stayed for only a few minutes before driving away again, not ready to confront the place or its people. She took the long way home, meandering through streets lined with magnolias and quiet lawns. As she drove, her thoughts drifted back to Granger and the card he had given her. She hadn't called it. It sat in her wallet like a memory she wasn't ready to revisit. That night, while the cafe closed in darkness and Mr. Whitaker likely counted receipts in silent frustration, something unexpected happened. A young woman named Allison, who had been seated near the counter during Emily's firing, uploaded a second video. Unlike the original clip that captured the moment of her dismissal, this one showed the aftermath. Emily walking slowly to the door, the silent tension of the room, the veteran trying to stand, Mr. Whitaker's angry face as he dismissed both of them with chilling indifference. Allison wrote just one sentence above the video: "This is what courage looks like." The two videos began to circulate together, their message amplified by the simplicity of the images. A woman kneeling beside a dog, a man holding back tears, a cold manager hiding behind rules. There were no politics in the footage, no debates, no sensationalism, just a clear contrast between decency and control. By midnight, hashtags were trending. People who had never heard of Jacksonville now shared opinions about a waitress named Emily and a man named Granger. Others began looking into the cafe. Yelp reviews were flooded with one-star ratings. Comments demanded accountability. Former employees started sharing their own stories of working under Mr. Whitaker. Strictness that bordered on cruelty, dismissals over minor infractions, an atmosphere of fear masked as efficiency. Emily slept lightly that night, unaware of the digital storm brewing in her defense. She didn't check social media. She didn't read the news. Her phone lay silent on the nightstand as she drifted between dreams and restless awakenings. But while she lay in bed, somewhere a stranger watched her video and made a decision. Somewhere a veteran sent the clip to his local chapter. Somewhere a group of Marines at the base nearby paused, stared at the image of their brother-in-arms, being ordered out and made plans of their own. By dawn, Jacksonville would not be the same. The next day would not bring closure or understanding, but it would bring something new. Not noise. Not confrontation, but presence. And it would begin with footsteps, many of them. By the time the sun rose again over Jacksonville, the videos had reached hundreds of thousands of people. Then, within hours, the numbers doubled. Major social platforms carried the clips, first as curiosities, then as statements of principle. Something in those shaky, unscripted images stirred people. Perhaps the quiet dignity of Emily, perhaps the way the veteran's departure cut through the air like a wound, or perhaps the stillness of the dog that never once barked. Whatever it was, it struck a nerve. In homes across the country, people sat with their morning coffee watching a stranger offer water to a dog and get punished for it. They watched a veteran, decorated, elderly, vulnerable, shuffled out like an inconvenience. And then they reacted. Comments poured in from all corners. Some were furious, condemning the manager and calling for boycotts. Others were deeply emotional, recounting their own stories of being dismissed, mistreated, or ignored while trying to do the right thing. Veterans especially rallied. The image of Thomas Granger being told to leave while his service dog panted on the tile floor became a symbol. Among those watching from afar was a Marine stationed just outside the city limits, Lance Corporal Jared Sloan. He had served briefly under Granger during his final deployment. Granger had once pulled him from debris after a vehicle explosion, and the young Marine still carried the scar on his forearm and the memory in his chest. When Sloan saw the video, he didn't hesitate. He forwarded it to others on base, to old friends, to his sergeant. Within an hour, more than 20 Marines had seen it. By noon, the entire unit was aware, and with that awareness came anger. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that runs deep and cold, forming into resolve. None of them wanted chaos, but they understood the power of presence. Back in town, Emily still had no idea how far the story had gone. She avoided social media, unsure if it would help or only deepen the ache she still felt. Her phone had buzzed all morning with calls from unfamiliar numbers, messages from reporters, and strangers offering jobs, encouragement, or just support. She ignored most of them, overwhelmed by the attention. She hadn't asked for a spotlight. She had only given a thirsty dog some water. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitaker paced inside the cafe. The breakfast rush had been slower than usual. A few regulars had come in and left quickly. Others took their coffee to go without speaking. He noticed the shift, though he pretended not to. He didn't yet know about the video, not in its full scope. He hadn't read the new reviews or seen the hashtags, but he felt it, in the silence. The averted eyes, the absence of familiar faces. Then, just before 1 o'clock, the front door opened. 2 Marines walked in, then 4 more, then a dozen. One by one in uniform they entered the cafe and sat at every table. The room filled quietly, like a tide coming in without a single splash. They did not speak loudly. They did not make demands. They simply ordered coffee, water, or sandwiches, then sat, waiting, watching. Whitaker noticed immediately. His jaw tightened. He walked out from behind the counter and approached one of the tables. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, voice clipped. One Marine looked up, his tone polite but firm. "We're good, sir, just here to support." "To support what?" The Marine said nothing more. He sipped his coffee. Whitaker glanced around. Every booth was occupied by men and women in uniform. Some wore medals, others bore fresh scars. Some looked no older than 20, others had the heavy stillness of those who had seen too much. There were no raised voices, no visible weapons, no slogans. Just presence. Customers walking in paused at the sight. A few turned around. Others took pictures discreetly. One woman began crying when she recognized a Marine she hadn't seen since her husband's funeral. Across town, Granger sat on his porch with his dog, staring at his phone as the number of notifications climbed. Beyond anything he had imagined. He hadn't planned for any of this. When he called Emily and gave her his card, he hadn't known her story would explode like this. He thought maybe he could help her find another job, maybe introduce her to a few local business owners, but this was bigger. He watched the footage again, not because he needed to see it, but because something about Emily's expression in the video had stayed with him. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't shouted or wept. She had simply stood, there sorrowful but unwavering, and let the moment play out with grace. He made a decision. By the end of the day, more veterans joined the Marines at the cafe. Some wore caps marking their service, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. Some brought their service dogs. All were there because they had seen a young woman do something decent and pay the price. Inside, the tension grew with every passing hour. Whitaker tried to maintain control, barking orders at his staff and reminding everyone to keep calm, though no one was panicking. Still, he could feel his grip loosening. The cafe was no longer his space of quiet dominance. Something had shifted. The walls were the same, the floor still creaked, but the spirit of the place had changed. Outside, people gathered quietly on the sidewalk, watching, talking, wondering what exactly had happened and who had started it all. Names floated in the air: Granger, Emily, Whitaker, attached to moments captured in grainy video, now etched into the public memory. Emily, finally opening her phone after hours of silence, saw the messages, the news articles, the video links, the tags. Her heart pounded. She scrolled through the footage, tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness but from the staggering wave of support. People she didn't know stood up for her. Veterans were returning, not in protest, but in solidarity. Strangers thanked her for her kindness, and among the flood of voices, one stood out. It was a message from Granger. "We're not done," it said. "There's something I want to show you." She stared at the words, unsure what they meant. But deep down, something told her that what had begun as a quiet act of compassion was far from over. The next morning, just after sunrise, The air in Jacksonville felt charged with something unspoken. A quiet electricity hung over the streets, subtle but unmistakable. At Sunnyside Café, the staff arrived early to find a line already forming outside. Not customers, but figures in uniform. Men and women standing in formation, hands behind their backs, faces calm and unyielding. Marines off duty but not off mission. The first wave stood in silence, not blocking the entrance, not shouting, but simply being there, present and unwavering. Mr. Whitaker arrived 15 minutes later, his car crawling toward the lot with measured unease. When he stepped out and saw them, he hesitated. The line of uniforms extended from the cafe doors to the edge of the block. His expression tightened. He pushed through the crowd, muttering vague greetings, pretending not to notice the way their eyes followed him. Inside, the cafe was quiet. The usual pre-opening bustle felt forced. Staff whispered to each other, unsure whether to speak at all. The events of the past days had stretched every nerve thin. Reviews online had plummeted. Regulars had vanished. Emily's absence was a ghost that hung in every corner. And now this line, this silent wall of uniformed memory. By the time the doors officially opened, more Marines had arrived. They entered without fanfare, without even a nod of recognition. Between them, some ordered coffee, others nothing at all. They took seats at booths along the bar in corners. Within 30 minutes, every chair was occupied. None of them said her name, but they didn't need to. Their presence was the statement. Mr. Whitaker walked the floor, forced smiles on his lips, trying to maintain a semblance of control. He greeted patrons with robotic cheer, though most didn't respond. The weight of the silence was suffocating. He made it halfway to the back when he turned and faced one of the Marines seated near the window. "Excuse me," he said, voice tight. "Is there something I can help you with?" The Marine looked up, eyes unreadable. "Just supporting a friend," he replied. "She doesn't work here anymore." "We know." The words hung between them like steel. Whitaker hesitated, then turned and retreated toward the office. Doors closed behind him, but nothing changed outside that room. The weight remained. The Marines kept sitting. As the morning passed, civilians began to enter, hesitantly at first. Some had come because they saw the videos. Others simply followed. The growing online movement. A few brought signs, though none lifted them inside. One woman carried a small bouquet and placed it on an empty chair in the corner where Emily had always sat during breaks. No one disturbed it. Meanwhile, across town, Emily stood on her porch with a thermos of tea in hand. The message kept coming. Friends, strangers, reporters, veterans. Her name was now tied to something far greater than she ever intended. She hadn't responded to most. But the one from Granger still burned in her mind. She hadn't called him back. Not yet, but something told her today would be different. Granger sat quietly in his truck parked just outside the cafe. He hadn't entered. Not yet. He watched from the distance, his dog sitting beside him, calm and ready. He wore civilian clothes, but his bearing had not changed. He watched the steady stream of Marines going in and out, the looks on the faces of the customers, the tremor of confusion on Whitaker's face as he peeked from the window blinds. His phone buzzed. A message from someone at the base. More were coming. He nodded once and put the phone away. Back inside, a young staff member named Caroline, barely 19, still new to the job, walked to the back and knocked on the office door. Whitaker opened, his eyes narrow. "What?" "There's a guy outside who says he's with the local news, wants to ask about the Emily thing." Whitaker's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Tell him no comment." Caroline nodded and turned away. He stared at the floor for a moment, then back at the cameras mounted above the cafe. His own decision had slipped away from him. What he thought would be a minor disciplinary issue had grown into a national symbol of injustice. And the worst part, he hadn't even realized it when it happened. He had thought of Emily as soft, unremarkable, replaceable. But now, everywhere he looked, her absence was louder than any presence. Meanwhile, the Marines remained. They didn't protest, they didn't chant, they didn't raise their voices, they simply held the space. One refilled a customer's coffee when a server couldn't keep up. Another helped a man with a cane to his seat. Small gestures that weren't about the cafe, but about the principle behind the uniform. Outside, the crowd grew. Emily, after a long hesitation, got in her car and began to drive. She didn't know what she'd say. She didn't know if she'd go inside, but she knew she couldn't avoid the storm forever. The world had called her name, and she wasn't the type to hide from that call. As she turned onto the main road and the cafe came into view, her breath caught. The line of uniforms, the stillness, the crowd, it was more than she could have imagined. She slowed the car and pulled to the side, watching. Her eyes scanned the scene until they landed on a familiar figure. Sitting behind the wheel of a truck just beyond the crowd, Granger. She parked and stepped out, walking toward him. He saw her, stepped out as well, and for a moment they stood in silence. Then he nodded. They showed up. "I see that," she whispered. "This wasn't planned. At least not by me." They saw the truth, and they came. Emily glanced at the cafe. "What do I do now?" Granger looked her straight in the eye, "But to see what your kindness started. Now you take this moment not to fight, not to shout." She looked again at the cafe, the people inside, the soldiers at the tables, the silent defiance held in stillness. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about going back. It was about something larger, about presence, unity, and the simple power of doing what was right. By noon, the crowd outside the cafe had doubled. What began as a quiet formation of Marine shad became something else entirely. A convergence of shared memory, respect, and a kind of collective indignation that needed no banners. Veterans from across the area arrived in pickups, motorcycles, and sedans. Some wore pieces of old uniforms, others came with hats marked by their branch and years of service, and many brought dogs, golden retrievers, Labradors, shepherds. Each animal bore the distinctive vests or harnesses of trained service dogs. Some walked beside wheelchairs, others rested calmly at their owners' feet as they gathered near the cafes. Windows or settled at nearby benches. It wasn't a protest. There were no chants, no signs, no speeches. It was presence, magnified. Inside, Mr. Whitaker sat behind his desk, unmoving. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from the franchise's regional office, unanswered voicemails, texts he didn't want to open. Every instinct told him to regain control, to issue a statement, to push back. But what weapon did he have against silence, against faces that wore no anger, only expectation? He stepped out into the dining area again. The servers were overwhelmed. Orders came slower, but no one complained. Plates were delivered to men who had once carried rifles through deserts and jungles. Coffee was served to women who wore their pasts, not in medals, but in the steadiness of their gaze. Customers sat in silence or spoke in hushed tones. And in the corner, the small bouquet someone had left for Emily remained untouched, bright against the faded booth. At one table near the window, a young veteran leaned down to offer his dog a small bowl of water. The movement caught the attention of a child nearby who approached curiously. The dog, calm and well-trained, gently accepted the child's outstretched hand. A mother stood close, unsure at first, but then softened when the veteran gave her a small nod. These were not confrontations. They were reminders. Emily, still standing beside Granger's truck, watched the scene unfold. Her heart beat fast, her breath catching in the middle of each inhale. She had never seen so many gathered for anything she had done. It felt overwhelming, almost surreal. But Granger remained steady beside her, one hand resting lightly on his dog's back, the other tucked into his jacket pocket, as if keeping her anchored by sheer will. "You don't have to go in," he said, watching her. "No one's asking that." "No," she answered, but she took a step forward. Crossing the street was like moving through a dream. Conversations paused as people saw her. Heads turned. A few quiet voices murmured her name. But no one called out. No one rushed forward. They simply stepped aside, creating a path that led straight to the cafe door. Inside, Whitaker looked up and froze. Emily stepped through the entrance, the small bell ringing overhead like a chime from another world. The scent of coffee and butter lingered in the air unchanged. But the atmosphere had transformed completely. Faces she didn't recognize nodded in acknowledgement. Veterans rose lightly from their seats or tilted their heads in quiet salute. A few smiled gently. Others looked as if they had been waiting for her all day. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She walked toward the booth where the bouquet still sat, placed her hand gently on the table and then turned to face the room. A dozen service dogs looked up as if recognizing her. The room held its breath, and then someone clapped. It wasn't dramatic or loud. A single, respectful clap from the corner, where a woman with graying hair and a jacket bearing the insignia of the Air Force sat. A moment later, another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the cafe echoed with applause, not thunderous, not chaotic, but rhythmic and resolute. Emily stood still, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She pressed one hand against her chest and nodded once, deeply. The applause faded, not with abruptness but with grace. The moment passed and everyone returned to their meals or conversations. She walked to a table where two Marines offered her a seat. She sat, hands trembling slightly, and accepted the cup of coffee handed to her without a word. Across the cafe, Whitaker stood motionless, staring at the scene he no longer controlled. He turned without speaking and returned to his office, closing the door behind him with finality. Outside, the sidewalk remained filled. People who couldn't get in stood patiently, some holding flags, others holding hands. The parking lot was full, not just with cars, but with a sense of something sacred taking place. What had started as a viral moment had become a movement, but not one of slogans. It was built on memory, service, and simple human decency. Granger eventually entered the cafe and made his way to Emily. He didn't sit, just stood by her side, his dog lowering itself next to her chair. She looked up at him, the lines of anxiety beginning to soften. "They came," she said. "They never left," he answered. Later that afternoon, a group of veterans approached her table. One of them, a man with a cane and deep scars on his cheek, leaned down and spoke softly. "We're opening a space downtown for vets and their families, a resource center, a real place where people can go and be safe. We want you to be part of it. We saw what you did. We saw how you made people feel seen." Emily looked at them, unsure of what to say, but she nodded, her voice catching as she tried to answer. "I'll be there," she finally managed. The group nodded, then returned to their seats. The day continued. More people arrived. Not everyone got a table. Many simply stood outside in solidarity. Emily stayed until the evening shadows began to stretch across the windows. And then she stood, thanked those around her, and stepped back outside. The air was cooler now, touched by the coming dusk. She looked at the sky, then at the street filled with people who had become something more than bystanders. They were witnesses to something rare, not just outrage, but unity. And it had all started with a bowl of water. By the time the crowd outside the cafe began to disperse that evening, the ripple effect had already reached far beyond the walls of Sunnyside Cafe. The internet had consumed the story like dry wood meeting fire. But while the online world debated, shared, and speculated inside the cafe, something much quieter was unraveling. A breakdown not of operations, but of belief. The people who worked there, the regulars who once felt at home, the silence in the back office, where Whitaker locked himself for hours, all of it pointed to a place no longer functioning as it once had. Caroline, the youngest on the staff, was the first to feel it. That morning, she had watched Marines fill the booths and veterans stand beside their dogs with quiet strength. She hadn't served anyone like them before. She'd only ever worked Saturday brunches and weekday lunch hours, her apron always smelling of syrup and disinfectant. But today she felt something settle in her bones, a kind of reckoning. She remembered Emily's laughter in the back kitchen, the way she used to leave notes taped above the coffee station with jokes or reminders to drink water on hot days. It was small things like that, Caroline realized now, that made this place livable. Now, those small things were gone. The rest of the staff was tense, whispering in corners, eyes darting toward the office door every time a new alert came in on their phones. The reviews were merciless. People shared screenshots, copied Emily's name in hashtags, and rated the cafe with a flood of single stars. Some reviews came from people who had never even stepped inside, but the message was clear. The story wasn't just about service or policy, it was about decency. And no amount of menu specials could counter that narrative. In the kitchen, the cook, Mike, who had worked there longer than anyone except Whitaker, threw down his towel after burning a second batch of toast. This place used to mean something, he muttered, mostly to himself, for ghosts. Now I'm just flipping eggs by mid-afternoon. An email came through from the regional director of the franchise, addressed to Whitaker but copied to the staff account. It was brief, clinical, but it cut deeper than any review. We are receiving an unprecedented volume of negative attention concerning the recent incident involving one of your former employees and a veteran patron. This situation is now under review. Please prepare a formal report and submit by end of day. Further action may be taken pending evaluation. No signature beyond a department tag, no pleasantries. Whitaker read it twice, then slammed the laptop. Shut! He paced his office, hand running through his thinning hair. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. His grip on this cafe, his rules, his routine, his standards, had held for so long without question. Emily had been just one more employee in the machine. He hadn't realized how much she meant to the people around her, how deeply her departure would fracture the illusion of control he had cultivated. He opened the security footage from that day, replaying it not to understand, but to look for something, anything that might justify his decision. But all he saw was a young woman, kneeling beside a service dog, a veteran watching with tired eyes, and himself entering the frame with a pointed finger and rigid command. No one would see leadership in that frame, only arrogance, only distance out. On the floor, the tension continued to mount. Customers came and left, most staying only long enough to glance around and realize what kind of place it had become. The few regulars who remained avoided eye contact with the staff. The trust had cracked. By closing time, Caroline approached Whitaker with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I'm giving notice," she said softly, not out of anger, but resignation. He didn't answer. She placed the paper on his desk and walked away. The next morning, 2 more staff didn't show up for their shifts. A delivery driver refused to cross the threshold, citing personal reasons. Another email came from the franchise, this one more direct, more urgent. "We are temporarily suspending online promotion of this location. Please cease all advertising until further notice. Corporate representatives will be conducting a site review within 72 hours. Ensure full compliance and staff cooperation." Whitaker read it and felt the final thread slip through his fingers. The internal crisis wasn't a sudden collapse, but a steady erosion. One decision, one moment of inflexible pride had triggered something irreversible. The cafe's identity had shifted. It was no longer the quiet breakfast nook by the base. It had become a symbol, and not the kind anyone wanted to be associated with. At dusk, he stepped out into the dining area, looking around at the half-empty tables, their remaining staff too tired to pretend. The bouquet for Emily still sat in its corner. No one had dared remove it. It had become a memorial, quiet and resolute. Whitaker stared at it for a long time, then he turned away. The call came just after 9 in the morning. Emily was sitting at her kitchen table, untouched toast on her plate, fingers wrapped around a warm mug she had refilled 3 times without taking a sip. She wasn't expecting it. Her phone had become a source of exhaustion more than communication. Each buzz, another headline, another offer, another stranger wanting something. But this number she recognized immediately. Granger. His voice was calm, just as it had been that first day. "I want to see you," he said. "Can you meet me downtown in an hour?" She hesitated, but the quiet urgency in his voice left no room for doubt. She agreed, dressed quickly, and left her apartment with a mind half spinning with questions she didn't dare ask out loud. When she arrived, he was already waiting on the sidewalk beside an old, shuttered storefront. The building was narrow, brick-faced, its windows dusty with years of abandonment, yet something about it felt anchored, like it had been standing too long to be ignored. Granger greeted her with a nod. He wore a black windbreaker and jeans, and his dog stood patiently by his side. "This is the place," he said, gesturing toward the building. "Come in." She followed him through the creaking door into a hollow room filled with echoes. Sunlight streamed in through a skylight above, catching particles of dust that danced silently in the air. The floor was worn, and the air smelled faintly of wood and thyme. A few folding chairs had been set up near the back, along with a card table. Holding papers, a set of blueprints, and 2 steaming cups of coffee, Emily looked around, confused but intrigued. "What is this?" she asked. Granger motioned for her to sit. "This building's been vacant for years," he said. "Used to be a hardware store, then a consignment shop, then nothing. But it sits at the center of town. Everyone passes it on their way somewhere. Else?" Emily listened in silence. "I've been talking to some folks," he continued. "We all keep coming back to one idea. Veterans mostly. A few business owners." And he unfolded a paper and slid it across the table. It was a sketch of a café, warm, open, with a large outdoor seating area, murals on the walls, and clearly marked accommodations for service animals. The name at the top, Liberty Grounds. Emily's hand covered her mouth as she stared at the design. "We want you to run it," Granger said simply. She looked up, stunned. "I don't have the money," she whispered. "I don't have the experience." "You've got more than either of those," he replied. "You've got people behind you, people who believe in you, veterans, civilians, folks who saw what happened and want to build something better from it. We've raised some funds, got a few backers. We'll handle the paperwork. What we need is someone who knows what compassion looks like in practice." She leaned back in her chair, the words washing over her like a wave too big to grasp. Just days ago, she was standing outside a cafe, with nothing but a folded apron and a silent goodbye. Now strangers who had watched her stand up quietly for a dog and a man were offering her a chance to build something entirely her own. Granger gave her time. He didn't push, didn't persuade. "Why me?" she finally asked, voice thin. "Because you didn't do it for recognition," he said. "Makes people follow someone. You did it because it was right, that's what." She swallowed hard, emotion rising in her throat. She looked again at the blueprint, imagining the place filled with faces, not just customers but stories. Veterans reading the paper with their dogs at their feet, young couples sharing breakfast, old friends finding each other again over coffee. Granger stood and walked toward the window. "They closed the cafe this morning," he said without turning. "For now. They're reviewing everything. Mr. Whitaker's been let go. Corporate stepped in. Shut it down." Emily didn't know how to respond. Part of her felt a strange emptiness at the news. Not satisfaction, not relief, but the hollow understanding that even just outcomes carry sorrow when people are broken in the process. Granger turned back toward her. "This isn't about revenge," he said, reading her silence. "With something better. It's about replacing something broken." She nodded slowly. "You won't be alone," he added. "We've got people to help. Legal, design, even someone to train staff. You'll make the decisions, but we'll build this together. Emily." I took a deep breath and stood, walking to the center of the room. She turned slowly, eyes tracing the space, imagining paint on the walls, tables filled with laughter, the smell of fresh bread and coffee. She imagined a place where dogs weren't questioned but welcomed, where veterans were more than footnotes, and where kindness was policy, not exception. She turned back to Granger. "I'll do it," she said. His smile was quiet, but full of meaning. "We'll start tomorrow." They stepped outside into the cool morning light. The street was quiet, but as they walked away from the building, people noticed them. A few nodded, a couple waved. One man raised a hand in greeting from across the street. Word would travel fast. Emily felt the change begin, not in headlines or hashtags, but in the solid grip of possibility. What had been taken from her was not gone. It had simply cleared the space for something new, something hers, something lasting. Liberty Grounds had no walls yet, no tables, no menus, but it had a foundation, and its first brick had just been laid. The following days unfolded in a rhythm unlike anything Emily had ever experienced. No longer bound by someone else's rules, she stepped each morning into the old storefront that was slowly becoming Liberty Grounds. The transformation wasn't dramatic, not yet. The walls were still stripped to their frames, the floor uneven in places, and the ceiling tiles discolored from years of neglect. But within that shell, a kind of momentum had taken root. Granger returned daily, never with fanfare. He brought paperwork, updates from the lawyer handling the lease, budget proposals, contacts for contractors, even a draft business license application. Emily watched as her name appeared at the top of the documents, Not as an employee, not as an applicant, but as an owner. Each time she saw it, she felt the strange weight of belief pressing gently on her shoulders. Veterans stopped by as word spread. They didn't ask for anything. Most just wanted to offer help. Skills in carpentry, electrical work, graphic design, bookkeeping. One afternoon, a woman who had served in the Navy arrived with a sketchbook filled with mural concepts. "We want the walls to tell stories," she explained. Emily flipped through the pages in silence, pausing at one that depicted a pair of boots beside a dog's leash under the rising sun. She didn't speak, but her hand lingered on the drawing before she nodded. Each small contribution became a thread in the growing tapestry. Liberty Grounds was not being built, it was being woven. One evening, as she was sweeping the front entrance, a black SUV pulled up quietly and parked across the street. Emily didn't recognize the vehicle, but something about its tinted windows and subtle design suggested intention. Moments later, a man in a crisp suit stepped out. He crossed the street and approached the door with calm purpose, holding a slim leather folder in one hand. "Emily Carson?" he asked politely. She lowered the broom. "Yes. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm with Lexington Development Group. May I have a word?" She blinked, uncertain, but nodded. They stepped inside. The air carried the scent of fresh sawdust and possibility. Reeves looked around, noting the bare beams and stripped counters, then turned to face her fully. "I'm not here on behalf of a complaint or any negative agenda," he said. "Quite the opposite. Our firm monitors emerging community projects with strong public engagement. Liberty Grounds has come up in multiple reports: online traction, local support, veteran involvement. We consider these factors when identifying candidates for investment." Emily folded her arms, unsure where this was going. "I'm here with a proposal," Reeves continued. "Grounds. Lexington would like to invest in Liberty." She raised an eyebrow. "Invest? In what? We're not even open." "That's precisely why," he said, placing the folder on a nearby surface. "Our offer includes funding for full renovation, interior design, ADA compliance, pet-accessible outdoor spaces, and promotional launch support. In return, we ask for a small equity share, non-controlling, limited to advisory input." Emily opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents outlining the terms, financial estimates, projected timelines, and endorsements from regional partners. Her eyes scanned the pages with growing disbelief. "Why me?" she asked again, softer this time. Reeves didn't hesitate. "Because your story became a symbol. Not manufactured, not curated, real. People followed it because they saw something rare, dignity without aggression, principle without performance. You're not trying to go viral, you just did the right thing. That has weight." She stared at the offer, feeling both the pull of security and the instinct to protect what she had only just begun to build. "I don't want this to become something corporate," she said. "It won't," Reeves replied. "That's not the model. We're not here to take over, we're here to accelerate what you already started. You hold the reins, we help pull the wagon." Emily said nothing. She closed the folder and looked around the room. She saw the bare bones of her cafe, the murals not yet painted, the tables not yet placed, the laughter and stories not yet lived. She thought of Granger, of the service dog, of the countless hands that had passed through the space this week, offering something not because they were asked, but because they wanted to be part of it. She didn't answer that night. She took the folder home, spread the papers out on her kitchen table, and stared at them long after the tea had gone cold. The numbers were tempting, more than tempting. They offered stability, structure, speed. But what haunted her most wasn't the idea of selling out. It was the fear of not rising to meet what others saw in her. The next morning she arrived early and waited for Granger. When he stepped in, she handed him the folder. He skimmed it quickly, then looked at her. "I didn't ask for this," she said, "but you earned it," he replied. "The question is, what do you want?" She looked around the empty room, then at the space where the coffee bar would be, where the community board would hang, where the corner nook would host dogs and their companions. "I want it to be honest," she said. "Help that steers us. If we take help, it has to be help that lets us stay true, not." "Then that's the answer," he said. She nodded. Later that day, she called Reeves and accepted the offer, with conditions. She wanted full creative control, no corporate branding. All hiring decisions to remain hers. Liberty Grounds would never be used to push anything outside its original mission: community, dignity, service. Reeves agreed without hesitation. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in days, Emily felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since leaving Sunnyside Café Hope. And this time it wasn't borrowed, it was built. The first sign that the franchise had severed ties with Sunnyside Café came quietly. The website removed its listing. Then the branded social pages, once filled with sunny breakfast specials and cheerful community photos, vanished from public view. For those who had followed the story from afar, it was confirmation that the corporation had taken action. For those still inside the town, however, the collapse was far more visible. The physical signage remained for a while, even after the doors closed for what was supposed to be a temporary suspension. The closed for renovation notice taped to the glass was a thin attempt at saving face. But no one believed it. The truth had taken root too deeply. Inside the building, the silence was thick. The kitchen had gone cold. The chairs remained stacked against the walls. Tables, once polished to a bright sheen, now collected dust. The scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee had been replaced by air tinged with disuse. Mr. Whitaker had not returned since the day corporate called him in for a final interview, an administrative formality that carried the weight of inevitability. He had entered the room knowing what was coming. He had violated not just internal policy, but public trust. The dismissal was swift, clean, and devoid of sentiment. The staff dispersed quickly after his departure. Caroline found work at a local diner where the atmosphere was less rigid and the laughter came easier. Mike, the cook, decided it was time to retire altogether, something he had delayed for too long out of habit. Others went their separate ways, none of them reaching out to each other in the aftermath. They didn't need to. The rupture had been clean, unforgivable. Community reaction was swift. Residents who had remained neutral during the controversy now felt emboldened to speak. Comments flooded every platform available, not to debate but to deliver judgment. I used to bring my dad there every Sunday after church. Not anymore. They chose policy over people. We saw it. Glad it's gone. Something better is coming, and something better was indeed coming. A few blocks away, Liberty Grounds was rising in stages. What had been hollow space was now a skeleton of purpose. Electrical wires had been rewired, plumbing had been replaced, the floor leveled, reinforced, and prepared for new tiling. Volunteers came in shifts, veterans who knew how to work with their hands, local business owners offering materials, students painting, under supervision from local artists. The mural wall had begun to take shape, a broad canvas of light and shadow, showing not war or loss but healing and connection. Emily moved through the space each day like a conductor guiding an unseen orchestra. She listened, instructed, accepted help, and offered encouragement. She had never led anything before, but leadership suited her in a quiet way. People followed because she didn't demand it. She simply made space for others to bring their best. Granger remained close by, handling logistics, making calls, coordinating deliveries. He never spoke of Sunnyside Café again, but one afternoon as he stood beside Emily reviewing tile samples, he paused and glanced toward the street. They thought they could erase a mistake by closing the doors, he said, in shuttering a building. It's in building a better one beside it. But the real repair isn't, Emily nodded. It's not revenge, she replied, it's proof. By the time the final pieces of equipment arrived, a set of high-grade espresso machines and 2 commercial ovens, the community had already begun to gather outside the front entrance in anticipation. People peered through the windows, commenting on the changes. Children pressed their hands against the glass. Elderly couples asked about the menu. Veterans lingered nearby, as if drawn by instinct to the place where their stories were welcome. And, while Liberty Grounds rose, the old cafe fell further into shadow. Graffiti appeared on the side wall, nothing crude, only 2 words. We remember. It wasn't removed. The building stood as a hollowed shell, a cautionary marker of what happens when a business forgets that people are more than transactions. One morning, Emily walked past the old location on her way to Liberty Grounds. She hadn't planned to stop, but her feet carried her to the door. She stood at the window, peering into the darkened interior. The layout was unchanged. The counters still stood, the booths still in place, but they looked different now, emptied not just of customers but of purpose. Behind her, a passerby slowed. "You should have been in charge of that place from the start," the woman said. Not unkindly, Emily smiled faintly. "No," she replied, "that place had its chance, now it's time for something else." The woman nodded and walked on. Emily turned and made her way to Liberty Grounds. The door was open. Light poured through the windows. Workers were laughing in the back. The smell of fresh wood and paint filled the air. She stepped inside and breathed, deeply. The past was behind her now, not forgotten, not dismissed, but placed where it belonged, not in bitterness, but in the foundation of what would come next. The morning Liberty Grounds opened. The town of Jacksonville stirred with a quiet anticipation that felt sacred. It wasn't a parade day or a public holiday, yet the energy rippling through these streets carried the gravity of both. Families woke early. Veterans polished their badges or buttoned shirts embroidered with campaign ribbons. Children pulled on shoes while parents packed folding chairs, knowing they might need to wait in line. Even the local florist sent arrangements unsolicited, filling the air near the new café with the gentle fragrance of lavender and rosemary. Emily arrived before dawn, unlocking the doors with a key that still felt surreal in her hand. The interior of the café, once a shell, now breathed with life. The mural wall stretched across the main room in rich, bold color, scenes of military service not in combat, but in community. A medic tying a bandage on a comrade's arm, a soldier reading to a child, a dog resting beside Ammon's boot. The images radiated dignity without fanfare. The furniture was simple, sturdy, handcrafted by volunteers using locally donated materials. At a far corner, a reading nook had been built with low cushions, dog-friendly floors, and a small library of books donated by veterans and their families. Photos lined the walls, framed portraits of those who had served, those who were still serving, and those who had simply lived kindly. As the sun rose, Emily stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the edge, taking it all in. The espresso machine gleamed. The pastry case was stocked. The lights flickered on one by one. Granger entered with his dog, gave her a brief nod, and took his usual place by the mural. Neither said much. They didn't need to. By 7 o'clock, the first guests arrived, a couple in their 60s, the man with a cane, the woman guiding a shepherd with a harness. Emily stepped from behind the counter to greet them. "Welcome," she said. "We're glad you're here." The woman smiled, her eyes glassy. "We've waited a long time for something like this." Within the hour, the line stretched down the block. Marines, active and retired. Civilians, business owners, nurses, families. Some wore shirts that read, "Kindness is policy." Other shelled small flags or photos. When the doors opened fully, there was no stampede, no rush. They entered with reverence, pausing to take in the space as though walking into something sacred rather than commercial. The café filled slowly, then completely. Dogs curled beneath tables, friends embraced. Orders were placed, names called, trays delivered with care. Emily floated through it all like a conductor of warmth, laughing with some, hugging others, offering refills and listening intently. No one was hurried, no one was pushed along. The rhythm was human. At mid-morning, a small ceremony was held in the back garden patio, where a flagpole had been raised days before. Granger took the lead, standing in front of the gathered crowd, holding a folded flag that had belonged to his father. Emily stood beside him as he spoke briefly, not of Wes, but of homes. "This is a place for stories," he said, "and for silence, for remembering and for starting again." He raised the flag slowly, the fabric catching wind at the peak. A moment of silence followed, then applause. Afterward, people lingered in the garden, sipping coffee under the early sun, dogs lounging. Their feet stories passed like heirlooms from one table to the next. A young Marine sat beside an older vet from a different war, both holding mugs and speaking softly, their words punctuated with shared nods. Later, a boy approached the reading nook and picked up a picture book. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside, a sleeping retriever, who opened one eye, approved the arrangement and closed it again. His mother watched from a nearby table, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. And through it all, Emily moved with the kind of grace that wasn't performed but lived. She wasn't just running a business. She was holding space, offering shelter, making dignity tangible. Reporters showed up. They stayed back at first, then began taking notes, asking quiet questions, marveling at the seamless integration of design, purpose, and emotion. One local station aired a segment that evening titled "A Cup of Coffee, a Town Rebuilt." It was watched more than any local program in over a year. By late afternoon, the foot traffic had slowed but not stopped. The volunteers who helped build the cafe were treated to dinner in the main room, served by Emily, and a handful of staff who had joined her vision from the beginning. There was no music playing, yet the room hummed with something deeper. Belonging. Granger approached her as the last guests left and placed something gently in her hand. It was a patch from his old uniform, slightly worn, but still proud. "You earned this," he said. "People. Not for service in war, but for something just as rare. Service too." She stared at it, unsure of how to reply. "Hang it where they can see it," he added. "Not to remember you. To remind them who they are." That night, when the lights dimmed and the last table had been cleared, Emily stood alone inside Liberty Grounds. She walked to the mural wall, pinning the patch just below the painting of the dog beside the boot. It clung there quietly. A testament. Outside, the town slept. But inside those walls, something had awakened, not just a business, a legacy. Months passed. The energy surrounding Liberty Grounds did not fade. It deepened. What had begun as a community's response to an injustice became something far more enduring. It evolved not into a trend, but into a rhythm of life for Jacksonville. The cafe was not simply a place to eat or drink. It was a living tribute, a quiet monument built not of stone or steel, but of compassion, loyalty, and shared memory. Emily never let the mission drift. She remained present, not as a figurehead, but as a leader whose influence stemmed from consistency rather than charisma. She greeted each person who walked through the door with the same authenticity she had shown that very first day when she knelt beside a service dog and offered a bowl of water. That small act had bloomed into a movement, and yet she had not changed. The world had taken notice, but Emily had only grown steadier. Veterans continued to come, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. Some visited just to sit quietly, to feel a part of something without the pressure of conversation. Others spoke openly for the first time in years, surrounded by walls that bore their stories, murals that reflected their unseen battles, and a community that listened without judgment. The cafe's pet-friendly spaces became more than amenities. They were sanctuaries. Dogs rested beneath tables during therapy circles. Children learned about service animals through school field trips, arranged by teachers who saw value in the lessons taught not through textbooks but through environment. Liberty Grounds began to host weekly gatherings, writing workshops for veterans, support groups for families, art nights where people painted their memories onto shared canvases. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Emily was invited to speak at the state capitol for a panel on small business and community resilience. She wore a plain dress, brought no entourage, and read from handwritten notes folded twice in her coat pocket. She told the story as it had happened, without embellishment. She spoke of kindness, not commerce, of respect, not revenge. When she finished, the room stood in silence before erupting into applause. Not because she had impressed them, but because she had reminded them of something essential. Liberty Grounds received a small grant that day, not because of the speech, but because of what it represented. The funds were used to expand the reading corner into a full community library focused on veteran literature, memoirs, and mental health resources. Granger, now officially listed as co-director of the cafe's outreach programs, curated the first shelf himself, headed a photo of his old unit beside it, along with the story of the day he first met Emily. One winter evening, as snow dusted, the town and the windows of the cafe glowed with amber light. A group of young recruits on leave entered for the first time. They were rowdy in the way only those who haven't seen war can be, but respectful nonetheless. They sat near the mural, ordered coffee, and eventually fell quiet, each of them staring at the stories on the walls. One pointed to the patch beneath the dog's portrait. "Whose is that?" he asked. Granger, wiping down a nearby table, overheard. "That belonged to a Marine who saw something wrong," he said, "and to a civilian who did something right." The young men nodded, unsure how to respond. "Respect lives here," Granger added. "You'll learn that." As they left, one of them turned and snapped a salute, not out of obligation but instinct. Granger returned it. Emily watched from the counter, smiling faintly. As time passed, the cafe began receiving letters, some from across the state, others from across the country. Veterans who had heard about the place and wanted to send thanks. Families who had lost someone and wanted to know their memory would be held somewhere gently. One envelope came from overseas, from a military base in Germany. Inside was a letter from a young medic who had watched the video from his bunk and decided, after months of silence, to finally ask for help. "I didn't think anyone cared," the letter read, changed. "Then I saw her offer water to a dog, and everything." Emily framed it. Each anniversary of the cafe's opening brought quiet commemorations. No press releases, no balloons, just a gathering of regulars, staff, and strangers who no longer felt like strangers. Granger would speak briefly. Emily would say a few words. A new name would be added to their memorial wall. Someone whose story had touched the cafe, even if they never set foot inside it. One spring morning, Emily stood in the garden, pruning the small tree planted at the rear of the patio. A woman approached, holding the leash of a black Labrador. She wore no makeup and her eyes were tired. "This place," she said softly. "My brother would have loved it." Emily stood and brushed her hands clean. "Tell me about him." And the woman did. They sat together on the garden bench as the cafe came to life behind them. Mugs clinking, voices rising in welcome, dogs stirring, boots on tile, a song playing, faintly from the speakers. The woman spoke for an hour. Emily listened for all of it. This, more than any award or recognition, became the rhythm of her days. To make space, to hold grief, to offer warmth. Not as charity, not as novelty, but as promise. Liberty Grounds never expanded into a chain. It never franchised or sought investment beyond its needs. It remained exactly what it was meant to be. One place in one town built on one moment of courage. Years later, someone painted a new addition to the mural. A woman kneeling beside a dog, sunlight catching the edge of a water bowl. The details were subtle, the gesture simple. But those who knew the story always paused there. They did not need to read her name to understand. They remembered. They carried it forward.